So, 2008 has been a humbling time, the period since then. I used to be at a school in New York City that thought very highly of itself for its financial wizardry. And even if we had crises of the accounting crisis in 2000, 2001, and even if the economy faltered and was coming out of a bubble in the 1990s because of the internet ratcheting up of investment, we still believed that we knew better than anyone else in the world how to design financial instruments and how to really build an economy around that. It turned out to be the case that because we were thinking of these issues in very narrow ways and we weren't thinking about the broader systemic risks of what we were actually doing, that trillions of dollars of value were lost in the global economy as a result. Now that's a very sobering message, but it was one that still in the United States we thought we could recover from because, well, this was just an economic crisis like many others, and maybe we'll pass a little bit in the way of financial regulation or financial reform, but we'll get back on track. Of course, when things are going bad in the United States, we like to point our fingers, right? Anytime we're in a recession or anytime we're struggling, we don't like to point our fingers, and usually we point our fingers in the direction of Asia. We say we have these trade imbalances. We have these surpluses in imports coming in, and it's really unfair, and mostly it's happening because these countries, China specifically, but usually the finger is cast all very broadly, that currency is being manipulated, currency is being held down to make it cheaper to export, and that's really the source of our woes. Right? Now, that's a very interesting take on what actually goes on, and the interesting thing about my own work is I like to think deeply about what we can learn from Asian economies. So it's been an interesting case being a China scholar over the last 10 years because China was sort of, we could explain China's economic prowess by two simple facts. Right? China was lucky because it wasn't as industrialized as Eastern Europe and Russia, and so it was easier to make the transition to an industrial economy, and there was a very deep, cheap labor pool. Right? So that explains it, right? That's an easy story because it's just because of the cheap labor that China has such an advantage, and this is going to run its course, like all developing economies do. And so that's really that we kind of mollified ourselves in thinking that that really explains what's going on in the global economy. But the reality is that in the United States, we are caught in a very dangerous political debate. One that basically takes the position that markets are the true magic of innovation, and if you just step aside, get the government out of the way, step aside and let markets work their magic, we will be able to have the best economy, the most innovative economy that will survive and thrive and flourish in the global system. Right? And this view is simply naive. And here's where I like to think about what has actually gone on in places like China and South Korea, and the fact that we should be so fortunate as to be able to learn from what's actually happening in economies that are much more adeptly and thoughtfully guided by a state. Right? So states and markets aren't systems that should be in opposition, they should be working hand in hand. Right? So let's take a couple of examples. So there's the story of China, the deep, cheap labor pool, exporting their way exporting their way to economic prosperity. That is only a very small part of what's actually going on in China. Think, for example, about the issue of sustainability. In the United States, we've been wringing our hands for the last about year because China has suddenly sped ahead of the United States in clean, renewable energy. Right? China is right now leading the way, China and Germany, in clean technology. Right? And in the United States, we're struggling over this question. All the venture capitalists are saying, why is China killing us in the area of clean technology? This is our turf. We're the most innovative economy in the world. And in fact, in September, the United States Steelworkers Union even filed a suit against China with the WTO for unfair labor practices. Well, it hasn't actually gone up, but they filed it with the Department of Commerce in the United States for unfair labor practices because they want to say any state that's subsidizing industry is a bad and unfair state. Right? And this is absurd. This is a ridiculous way of thinking. The only thing that we can think about is that we wish venture capital would come in and build this industry, and venture capital is sitting on the sidelines because you know what? It takes about 30 years to to build a viable industry like this, and venture capital wants 7-year exit strategies, right? And so what do you have there except a government and a group of people who are concerned over the fact that unfair practices are happening when what they should be doing is learning how to coordinate the economy. Take a second example. I was just speaking with Jay over dinner about how interesting it is that Korea suffered in the Asian fiscal crisis of 97, 98. Right? That was a really hard time for South Korea. Right? But what happened this time? What happened in 2008, 2009? South Korea has been one of the most impressive stories of weathering the storm that has been the global fiscal crisis. Why? Because the government actually learned lessons from the Asian fiscal crisis of 97, 98 and didn't repeat the same mistakes. The currency reserves were up. A lot of the industries had actually gone through a process of industrial upgrading, so that if you take a table like Hyundai, there is an organization that I think is fascinating because we have watched the evolution of that product line. Right? We have watched the industrial upgrading that is so impressive that you can only see it in examples in places like Germany. And so here again, we sit on the sidelines in the United States and we say, what's wrong with the markets? And it must be the fault of everyone else. Instead of actually thinking how to coordinate across industries and how to think long term, put the right incentives in place for everybody to work to build their economy. So the main message that I would like to take to people often is that when we look at Asia, we should be learning about how to build better market economies. Right now in China, that's an interesting mind bender, because how is it the case that the largest communist society in the world could be outdoing us in capitalism? But it is. But I think another interesting case is really South Korea. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for me to actually be a part of a conversation and be in dialogue with a bunch of alumni who are here and know more about this economy than I do, and allowing me to sit down and talk with people and really learn as much as I can through that process. Now, the final message that I like to always emphasize with respect to these issues is that I hate the saber rattling that goes on from Washington, because there are no two ways about it. Our economies, the U.S. and Asia, the U.S. and China, the U.S. and South Korea, we are fundamentally interdependent. There is no way we can go back on that. Right? In the case of China, China's been very strategic in building up its foreign reserves to create that kind of political interdependence. Economic interdependence leads to political interdependence. But China has a long-term strategy with that with Taiwan. They've done a similar thing with Tibet, and so they build these economic interdependencies to make political problems go away. But I think the same can be said in many ways for South Korea. Those trade imbalances are not a threat for us. They create the interdependency that means that we are fundamentally one set of nations that are allies and need to constantly be working together. So I was very gratified when the G20 happened here, because I actually think that it really places the right set of values and the right set of countries at the center of this conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to